Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, social marketers around the world. My name is Patrick Cook, and as president of the International Social Marketing Association, it's both my privilege and my pleasure to introduce the 28th in a series of webinars designed to advance social marketing teaching, research, and practice. I'm here today with Susie Coppathorne and Tamara Harbour. Susie is our technical host for the webinar series, and Tamara is the manager and moderator. We're going to begin in just a few minutes, but before we do, I'd like to share just a couple of quick updates on things that are happening in the next little while. Just to keep everyone abreast of what's happening with ISMA and the board, we are meeting again in early December. And then we are talking about a number of issues, including organizing our annual general meeting sometime in early 2018. So look for information about that. Just to remind folks, the Consensus Principles and Concepts paper, something that has been in the works for the last 2 years, is now available on the ISMA website. And that is a consensus paper that was put together by the European Social Marketing Association, but has been endorsed by most of the social marketing associations around the world. Just a quick reminder, as a member of ISMA, you are eligible for discounts on multiple publications, including Social Marketing Quarterly. So you get a 20% discount on their annual subscription, which I think works out to around $69. And then just a reminder, you've seen some of these opportunities on the slides leading up to the webinar, but there are some professional development opportunities coming up in 2018. There's the Behavior Change Communication Summit that's coming up in Indonesia in April, and the International Social Marketing Conference, which is coming up in Singapore in July. So I would like to now turn it over to Tamara. And Tamara, can you take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. And welcome everyone to our webinar today. I want to remind you, if there's more than one person at your location who's listening in at this time, we'd appreciate it if you would let us know how many of you are. Just type in the number in the chat box if there's more than one of you at your location. And we also ask that as you're listening to the webinar, if you think of questions, please just type them into the text box as they come to you. There's no reason to wait until the end of the talk. We will flag your questions and answer them at the end in roughly the same order that they came in. And also, before we start, we'd like to know where our listeners are from. If you could help us with this poll, just fill out where you are located and what part of the world you are in. And there we go. So I will close the poll. So this is Western Europe and North America. And we have a second poll. If you could just let us know how you found out about this webinar today, whichever box applies to you. And it's usually the emails. And the website. And okay. So there's the results, yes, the emails and the website. All right, thank you very much. And we will move on to introducing our webinar presenters today. I'm happy to introduce Diogo Veríssimo and Tilak Chaudhary as our co-presenters for today's webinar. They both bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to the topic of environmental conservation. Diogo is a leader in the use of social marketing to conserve biodiversity. His 10 years of experience as a behavior change specialist have been focused on issues such as human-wildlife conflict, wildlife trade, and community-based conservation. Diogo holds a PhD in biodiversity management from the University of Kent in the UK, and he's currently an Oxford Martin Fellow at the University of Oxford, also in the UK. He has authored more than 60 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters, and just last year, in 2016, Diogo was recognized with a Young Professional Award by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Even more recently, earlier this year, in 2017, he was also recognized by the Society for Conservation Biology with their Early Career Conservationist Award. Diogo also happens to be a founding member of the European Social Marketing Association, and he's also the technical advisor for behavior change and impact evaluation with the Living with Tigers project, which is what we'll be hearing about today. Our other presenter, Tilak, works for the Green Governance Nepal. He is the project manager of the Living with Tigers project, where he is in charge of planning field interventions to mitigate human-tiger conflicts. He also coordinates with conservation partners and conducts field visits. He has a degree in forestry from the University of Nepal and a master's in forest science and forest ecology with the University of Göttingen in Germany. For 2 years, he worked with a non-governmental organization and also worked on a USAID-funded project for 10 months after graduating. His main interests lie in the field of conservation, forest and biodiversity management, and working with local communities in conservation efforts. This is going to be a really interesting webinar, so I will turn it over to our first presenter today, Tilak. Over to you.
Thank you, Tamara, for nice introduction. I hope everybody could hear me clear. Today we are going to talk about the tiger conservation and social marketing in Nepal. And I'll be talking more on the background of the project, whereas my fellow colleague will talk on the formative research and impact evaluation of tiger mitigation human-tiger conflict mitigation in Nepal. So I hope everybody knows where Nepal is located in the global map. It is located in the South Asia between the two giant countries, Nepal, India and China. It has an area of 147,000 square kilometers and a population of 26.5 million. And the major occupation of the people here in Nepal is agriculture, and the elevation of the country ranges from 70 meters to 8,848 meters. That is the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. So Nepal is uniquely rich in the biodiversity attributed to the geography it has and the drastic change in the elevation within 193 kilometers north-south distance. So Nepal, though Nepal is a small country with only 0.1% of the global area, but it represents the flora of 3.2% and fauna 1.1% of the globally recognized fauna. So in context of the conservation scenario in Nepal, it has given a great effort so that Nepal has 40% of its total area covered by the forest, whereas out of the 40%, 17% of the total area is declared as a protected area. And altogether there are 20 protected areas which are managed by Department of National Park and Wildlife Conservation. We are talking about the national parks and protected areas here because we are mainly living with tiger is working in the protected areas. So having said the protected areas, government of Nepal has given great emphasis in the conservation, like it has mobilized community people for anti-poaching unit and also mobilized Nepal Army to initiate the anti-poaching in the protected areas. Apart from that, buffer zone areas around the national parks are managed by the community so that they are also involved in the conservation area. Since we are talking about the tigers, human-tiger conflict, so Nepal has started Tiger Conservation Action Plan before Global Tiger Summit in 2010. So the Tiger Conservation Plan started in 2008 for up to 2012, and then in 2010, in the Global Tiger Summit, Nepal committed to double its tiger population by 2022. Since then, Nepal has implemented the National Tiger Recovery Program, and as a result, it has been found that tiger population has increased to 198 from 121 in 2008. Having said that, the conservation does not come easy. Nepal has also been facing a lot of problem in the conservation, such as like illegal poaching and trade of the wildlife, and then community people living around the protected areas are encroaching the area, and mainly the harsh terrain of the Nepal makes most of the protected areas insufficient with the resources and the infrastructure. With increasing wildlife population, human-wildlife conflict in Nepal are also increasing. As the population of Nepal is 26.5 million, the pressure on the resources are increasing. And with the development, there are a lot of problems faced because most of the development are not environment friendly. And then the policy we have for the wildlife conservation dates back to the 1979. So it needs to be amended, which are still unprocessed, but it's time consuming. Having said that, we have a very good conservation action put into the conservation of wildlife. The human-wildlife conflict in different protected areas are increasing. You can see in this slide that the overall trend of human-wildlife conflict in protected areas has increased in last 8 years. So in acronym, you can see the CNP, BNP, and others. We have altogether 20 national parks, and we have focused on the Chiton National Park and Bardia National Park, and all other protected areas are kept under others. So the majority of the conflict we can see in the Chiton National Park. So in terms of the animals which are causing major human-wildlife conflict are elephant, rhino, and tiger. And all other animals like wild boar, deer, and wild buffalo are grouped as other. So in this slide we can see there are human-wildlife conflict by different animals. So while looking at the human-wildlife conflict, there are not only the human casualties, but the death of the wildlife also do occur. And we can see that basically most of the rhino and tiger are killed during the human-wildlife conflict as a result of poaching or retaliatory killing by electrocution, poisoning, or even natural death are the causes of the death of the wildlife. And if we look at the human casualties or human injury, they are also increasing with the time. Having said the background that human-wildlife conflict is increasing in Nepal, Chester Zoo, partnering with the Green Governance Nepal in the funding of Darwin Initiative, has initiated the Living with Tigers project to reduce the poverty from human-wildlife coexistence. The major objective of the project is to promote the human-wildlife coexistence in the shared landscape by reducing the loss and damage of both human and tigers by implementing the preventive measures and alternative livelihoods that are off-farm livelihoods, and increasing the tolerance level of the communities living around the protected areas or in the buffer zone area. So basically, the project is working in the two national parks, Bardia National Park and Chiton National Park. Bardia National Park is situated in the western lowland of the Nepal, whereas Chiton National Park is situated in the central lowland of the Nepal. Within each national park, we are working with the two community forest user groups that are around the buffer zone areas. And having said that, I would pass the presentation to Diego to provide more details on the research. Over to you, Diogo.
Thank you very much, Tilak. That's a really wonderful introduction to the project. So I'm hoping to talk to you all about two sort of sides of implementing social marketing interventions that often don't get a lot of attention when in the realm of nature conservation. This is because very often we look at nature conservation as being a crisis discipline, so we need to act fast, we need to put things on the ground quickly to avert some of these threats that the environment is under. But we, with this particular project, we felt that it was important that we invested a little bit more time, a little bit more resources, both on this formative research, on understanding the situation the best we could, and on the other hand, really focusing on the impact evaluation, because, of course, with projects that work on very serious or behaviors that have very serious consequences, like, for example, someone getting attacked or seriously injured by a large carnivore, it's really key to make sure that we have those lessons learned that are robust, so we can contribute not just for this set of communities that we work with, but also more broadly to the knowledge that we have about dealing and managing conflict between local communities and wildlife. And so the first aspect that we focused on was impact evaluation, and the reason that was the case was because very often many of the conservation marketing or social marketing projects will do very simple before and after analyses. And so, for example, here, in the example in my slide, if you're implementing a water conservation program and you're measuring water usage, and you measure it before the project and you measure it after the project, and in this case, if you look at the slide, you see there's a reduction of water usage. So you would assume that yes, the intervention has been a success. We have achieved our objective, but there's at least one published case where of a project exactly like this, where the only thing that changed was that there was more precipitation. So there was more rain. People used a lot less water for things like watering the lawns and some other tasks. And so really, there's really no way of saying if was the intervention successful or was just some other environmental indicator that changed while the intervention was being implemented. And this is particularly relevant for a lot of these social marketing interventions that happen in the conservation space, because very often we are talking about interventions that last several years. And in the space of several years, many things change, not just the program that's being implemented. And so how do we go about this? How do we try to tackle this challenge? Well, we try to think about it in a sort of counterfactual way. So what is the counterfactual? The counterfactual is what the world would look like without that program that we implemented, right? So what would have happened if there had been no Living with Tigers project? And of course, this is almost by definition something that is impossible to observe because you either implement the Living with Tigers project or we don't. So there's no multiple parallel universes that we can use to observe what the world would look like. But we can try to find something that is close enough. And in our case, of course, what we went for was to try to think about the selection of control sites. And of course, that seems a little bit simpler than it is in practice. So you might think, well, maybe we can just find a counterfactual in a control site, like say the next village over, or some other village that's close to a forest. But the reality is that communities are very different from each other, and even communities that are close by in sort of number of kilometers, for example, might actually be quite different for historical, cultural, geographical reasons. And so we had to make this process a little bit more explicit, a little bit more data-driven, so that we could ensure that when we think about a control site or a control community, we're actually talking about something that is comparable to the sites where we're working, because only in those conditions will we be able to interpret the results as if it was an actual counterfactual, as if it was an actual representation of what the world looks like when there is without the project, right? And so how do we go about making this a little bit more sort of data-driven, I guess? So in our case, the interventions or the communities where the program was going to work were chosen based on need. And by this, I just mean that there were the communities that were selected as the ones that needed this type of poverty alleviation and conflict reduction, some of the ones that did the most. And of course, there's all sorts of ethical reasons for working in this way. So given that, what we did then was to think about control sites and think about control sites not in a way that they have to be the same in every single way, because that's just not possible. No two communities on Earth are exactly the same. And so what we focused on was to make them similar when it comes to some of the variables that are most likely to impact the results of the intervention. And so what are some of those? Well, there are things like, for example, in Nepal, a lot of the community forests are organized according to buffer zone user committees. And so these buffer zone user committees make a lot of the rules in terms of what is used and how it's used. And so, of course, those rules are pretty important. And so we had to have control communities for our project sites that were within the same buffer zone user committee. Of course, they also had to have similar histories of conflict with tigers and perceptions of tigers, because otherwise it would be they would be very likely to react differently to the intervention that we're implementing. And so those were also two things we took into account. Similarly, we were looking for communities that had several or similar levels of dependency on natural resources, of course, and there were similar distances of major markets. And this last indicator is really more of a measure of how easy it would be for a community to take on an alternative livelihood. So distance to market or to the biggest city, which is similar in most cases, most often signals how, for example, Able would be a community to take on not only just different crops, but also different types of activities like ecotourism. And so those types of things are also very likely to condition how intervention, the outcomes of an intervention in a particular location. And so after the community sites or the project sites were selected based on need, we surveyed a number of communities around them to then find those communities that had the closest possible characteristics in the number of parameters, the ones I just described to you. And that was how we got to our final experimental design, which is of 4 treatment sites or 4 program sites and 4 control sites that are split evenly by the 2 national parks that Tilak just described, Chitwan and Bardia. Exactly as this map shows here, as similar to what Tilak had referenced to earlier on. This, of course, will then allow us to use sort of what is called the difference in differences estimator. And this is basically just saying that we first look at the changes in the control or the project sites. We look at the changes and the control site, and we do a difference of those differerences and see how much if we assume that the world would have continued to evolve as it evolved in the case of the control site, with whatever changes that or lack of changes are registered, then how does that compare to how things happened or things evolved in the sites where the program is working? And that difference in those differences is what gives us an estimate of the difference or the impacts of this particular project. So that was one of the challenges that we had. But there was a second challenge that we had for this particular Living with Tigers project, and that is that very often is, and comprehensibly, it's very difficult to get people to say the truth when you ask them about illegal behaviors. So of course there are a lot of behaviors or rules, say legal rules that govern how people can use natural resources, and of course Nepal is no exception. There are a number of rules about how people use resources, and particularly one interesting and important key indicator of conflict is this retaliatory killing. So how community members often, because of attacks on people or on their livestock, then often then go on to injure or kill some of these predators. But of course, this is not only a very difficult thing to talk about because it is punishable with a lot of time, with a lot of jail time in Nepal, and is also so we sort of adopted a technique that was initially developed in criminology, which is called Unmatched count technique. It's also called a listing experiment, and the objective really was to try to use a technique that would allow the respondent to stay anonymous, while as researchers or as program implementers, we would be able to get an estimate of how prevalent that behavior was in the community. So what proportion of the community had engaged in that behavior that was pretty important for us to have a measure of. So this is not although this technique is from criminology, it's been already used in conservation a few times. One of them specifically with the issue of killing of carnivores, and this was in Taiwan. And as you can see in your slide, this is not very clear, but for each category you have two estimates, right? And the one on the right is the one that was obtained by simply asking directly to people. Have you killed this animal? Have you killed that animal? Have you hunted this or X or Y? And the one that's on the left for each of the categories is the one that was obtained with a technique that is similar to the uncount match technique in sort of its objectives, to really allow people to remain anonymous while the researchers still manage to obtain this information. And so, of course, what we can see from here is that particularly for a few of the species, they are legally protected. People are much more willing to reveal this information when they are covered by anonymity than when you ask them directly. And so, how does this technique actually work? How is it possible to remain anonymous while revealing the necessary data to the researchers? Well, this is how it works. The way it works is you take a sample of respondents, you divide them randomly between control and treatment, and you present two lists. They are the same for both the control and the treatment, except in one respect. Except in one activity. So exactly like the one you're seeing here with card 1 on the bottom, where you have, say, a list of 4 items for the control group, but for the treatment group, you have those same 4 items and then a 5th sensitive item. And the idea here is to simply ask the respondents, how many of these activities have you engaged in some predetermined time frame, in the last 3 months, in the last year, in the last 6 months, whatever is relevant, right? And the goal here is to look then at the averages. So how many activities on average respondents say that they've engaged in, look at the means of the different groups, and then statistically not only compare to see if they're different or not, but also then extract a prevalence, as in what proportion of the respondents had engaged in the sensitive behavior that we're interested in, right? And so, how did it play out specifically for the Living with Tigers? Well, in terms of living with tigers, the way it played out was these were the images that were used in the control group. So you can see images that are sort of everyday activities, things like collecting firewood, collecting grass for cattle fodder, fishing, collecting snails. So very much sort of everyday activities. And then this was what was shown to the control group, and people were asked, how many of these activities have you engaged in? And for the treatment group, though, there was another activity, which is, in this particular case, the killing of a tiger. And we then proceeded to analyze the data in the way that I just described before, looking at the averages of the two groups, the control and the treatment, and then thinking about looking at prevalence, so the numbers of people that had engaged in that particular sensitive behavior that we were interested in. So I'm sort of going to run you through very quickly what were the steps that we followed so far to implement some of this work. With and looking at time, I'm really a little bit conscious of time, so I will do this fairly quickly. But of course, really happy to answer any questions. And of course, also have Tilak here, who's really been one of the key people in the implementation of the program. So in terms of our step 0, it was really about understanding the target audience, and because we were talking and we were dealing with a situation where the behaviors that we're trying, or the risk we're trying to mitigate, are pretty serious. So in many cases, people getting injured or attacked. We really felt that it was important to really invest heavily on this part, and so we did both qualitative and quantitative work to have a pretty good and sort of in-depth understanding of the issue. Then, of course, we moved on to mapping conceptually how these issues related to each other, and this was particularly important because there's sort of this dual mandate of the program. On one hand, the poverty aspect; on the other hand, the conflict, which of course are linked because the communities that the project works with are heavily dependent on natural resources. But still, it was really important that we had this very explicit, we made very explicit our assumptions and the linkages that we were assuming between some of the project outcomes and specific behaviors. We then moved on to think about threats at each of the sites, and this was important because we felt that was really important to not make the assumption from the beginning that the two sites we were working with were similar. And in fact, one of the key messages of this process at this step 2 was that actually they were pretty different. While Bardia was much more about attacks on livestock, Chitwan was much more about attacks on people themselves. And so this, of course, then made it so that the strategy for the two sites was quite distinct. In terms of the thinking about selecting behaviors for Bardia National Park, it was much more about improvement of livestock sheds and the building on one hand, of course, building the capacity for community members to do those improvements, but also focusing on improvements that could be made without a lot of investment and with materials that are available locally. And of course, in Chitwan, focused much more on the way that natural resources are collected, and this is because a lot of the attacks on people happen when people are collecting, say, firewood or grass for cattle feed, and so that was much more the focus of the project there. So in terms of thinking about target audiences, in the case of Bardia, much more focused on, of course, on livestock, households that are close to the forest, because those are more likely to come in contact or be more in proximity of habitat of these big carnivores. While in Chitwan, it was much more about, again, thinking about the behavior around natural resource collection, and particularly around incentivizing or the focus on group, making it more of a social activity rather than individual, as it's often the case. In terms of key influence, there's also a big difference between the two parks in that Chitwan has is a very big tourist hub, while Bardia is only now starting to grow sort of its tourism sort of component, and so a more sort of richer sort of social sort of atmosphere and social network, I guess, around Chitwan National Park than in Bardia, and so of course also some differences between the two sites there. Right, in terms of thinking about benefits, the benefit exchange, in the case of Bardia, of course, very focused on the opportunity costs, because when we push for a more active management of livestock, of course, that is time that community members will not be able to use for other activities, and of course that opportunity cost can be quite high in developing countries. So that's definitely something that we had to bear in mind when thinking about this benefit exchange. In the case of Chitwan, of course, perhaps more of an issue around the way that resource collection has always been done or has traditionally been done, and so sort of breaking that habit. That's perhaps was more of the focus. Right. So one of the things that I want to sort of emphasize around the messaging and the way we messaged some of our ideas and suggestions was that we didn't want to make it about wildlife. We wanted to make it about the livelihoods of the community, and this is because very often it is the case that conservation projects are emphasize so much the focus on wildlife that it can create resentment, particularly when situations where communities see a lot of investment around the conservation of a particular species and a much smaller investment in terms of improving livelihoods. And so with the Living with Tigers project, we really wanted to emphasize sort of the livelihoods aspect of it. And lastly, of course, in terms of the implementation, so that's something that's beginning to be rolled out, and given the relatively small geographical sort of focus of the project, we'll most likely focus on community level events, sort of in-person physical events, and there's with some potential to use in terms of mass media, some FM radio, which has a relatively big audience in that region. And so I will now, just for the final slide, just pass the presentation back to Tilak to talk us a little bit more about what the types of activities that have been done so far in this first sort of stages of implementation of the Living with Tigers project.
Thank you, Diogo. Actually, I think we're running out of the time. I will briefly guide you through what we have done till in the Living with Tiger projects, engaging local communities and putting on the interventions, like to reduce the human pressure on the natural resources. We have been promoting biogas installation in the community so that they don't have encounters with the tiger or other wildlife while they are in the forest collecting the natural resources. Or we are even trying to promote the livestock husbandry practices that that could improve their livelihood through the livestock rearing. And besides that, we are also interacting with the community regarding the habitat of the tiger or tiger ecology, their movement pattern, and what part of the forest tiger are common, so that we can reduce the number of people going into those core areas, so that we can minimize the number of the attack of the people. So apart from that, we are working to improve the livestock protection, because as Diego already mentioned that we have two different national parks, whereas in Chitwan we have human casualties higher in number and livestock depredation is higher in Bardia National Park. So we are also promoting the improved livestock shade because we are also working with the leopards. So leopards are mainly problematic because they depredate the livestock from the sheds. If they don't have the improved livestock sheds, they can easily be attacked, so that the tolerance level of the local community could go down. So besides that, we are also providing the trainings to the local community on improved husbandry practices and veterinary cares, and trying to promote or establish the communal grazing land where they could have space to graze their animals. Because in Nepal, we have what we usually have in practice is that we take our livestock into the forest for grazing. So there is a high chance of being encountered with the wildlife or tiger. And what project aims is to promote the alternative livelihoods that are of farm activities like handicraft making or fisheries, and then providing training on the electronic equipment repairing, and promoting homestays which could promote ecotourism within the protected areas. So we have completed our initial feasibility study of identifying the alternative livelihood, and we will be rolling out soon, implementing the alternative activities. Besides that, we are also working on the awareness and behavior change. We have, as Diego has mentioned, a lot about the behavior change, what we are doing on our field. We are also interacting with the communities, understanding their behavior. Apart from that, we have the social and ecological research going on to understand the relationship between the human and tigers. As a part of that, our colleague from Oxford University is doing camera trapping to understand the ecology of the tiger in both national parks, and so that we could have the result like one in the map here. So we could see that where are the potential hot spots for tiger or leopard to occur, so that we could provide them the warning that these areas are most potential for encountering with the wildlife like tiger and leopard, and you should be safe while going into the forest. So we are doing ecological research. Apart from that, we are working with different stakeholders at different levels, at local level, at regional level, and national level. At national level, we have been working with the Department of National Park and Wildlife Conservation, whereas at regional level, we are working with the Chitwan National Park. And at local level, we are working with community buffer zone user groups. So we have been sharing about the projects at the different levels and planning activities with the local communities. And apart from that, we have been doing the awareness campaign in various activities like celebrating the Wildlife Week. In those Wildlife Weeks, like we are presenting different topics or talking about the different topics on human-wildlife conflict or wildlife conservation at different forums at the local community level. Besides that, we want to steer our project in a way that we want to achieve our target. So we have been monitoring our project activities regularly, not only by the project staff or project members, but also by the other stakeholders like user committees, national park, even journalists. And then we have regularly observing our field activities so that we could improve on what we are doing. So with this slide, I would like to say thank you. If you have any questions and queries, it is highly welcome. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Tilak and Diogo, for such an interesting presentation. I'm sure we all learned a lot, not just about tigers, but of course all the interesting techniques you've used. So let's get started with our Q&A. If anybody has any questions, please just type them into the chat box and we will put them to Diogo and Veríssimo. Diogo and Tilak. This is the perfect time to ask questions. They're right here for you. You can ask questions directly. And one question I do have about the Living with Tigers project is, living with tigers is obviously a very high-risk situation. It can lead to casualties. It can lead to human deaths or livestock death. And here is a social marketing plan that is presenting and promoting new behaviors to reduce the human-tiger conflicts and the human injuries. But how did you ensure that the new behaviors that you were promoting in the social marketing plan were actually safe ones and would keep livestock and people safe and not do any harm?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk, say a few words about that, and of course I would be interested to know what Tilak has to, what thoughts he has on this. So this is definitely something that we were very concerned with, and this is one of the reasons why we sort of went a little bit above and beyond in terms of all the research and doing not only the qualitative and quantitative work with the communities we're going to work with, but also doing some expert consultation and literature review around this issue. And this is because in Nepal, from a purely statistical point of view, there are not a lot of instances of attacks on people or by tigers, and so of course these are every single one of them is of course a tragedy. But if you're thinking about from a statistical point of view, we want to determine sort of patterns of who is most at risk, what is the profile of the victim of these attacks. Then of course. Often the information is a little bit scarce, and so what we did then above and beyond was to not only consult with different experts who had experience of working in Nepal in tiger conservation, but also in addition to also do a literature review not only of similar work in Nepal, but also similar work in some parts of India that have similar challenges. And this was exactly to establish that what we were putting forward was really something that we had full confidence that would provide benefits. I don't know if you, Tilak, you want to add a few thoughts to this?
Yeah, I can add a few things. Like what Diego has already presented, that we have two different national parks. And then if you look at the livestock depredation in Bardia National Park, it's basically, if you look at the data or the report from the national park, then we could see that most of the incidents occur during the grazing time when they are into the forest. So what we could see that most of the incidents that are occurring in the Chiton are when they are in the forest. So that's why I think we are trying to change the behavior, that they do not go for grazing in the forest, but or they can do in the communal land. And even we have the depredation of goats and small livestock from the sheds that were made of traditional materials that were easy to break through. So we want to promote that promote improved livestock sheds. I hope.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. And I will ask, just for clarity, are there impact results yet, or are you still waiting for the impact results to see how the social marketing intervention actually worked out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is definitely something that it's still in the future to come, and we're hoping to have some results later, perhaps later next year. But still, the information is not yet collected, and so we don't really have impacts to report at this time. I don't know if Tilak, if you know of any anecdotal evidence that could help us maybe talk a little bit more about that. But of course, that because these are systems that have a lot of noise, there's a lot of natural variation. We want to be a little bit careful in terms of talking about impacts of the project at this point, I think.
Yeah, I agree with Diego that we don't have any significant impact now, but we have the feeling from the community people that they feel their livestock are safe in the improved predator-proof pens, but we don't have the data collected on this regard.
Can I ask how you are collecting the data? How is the evidence being collected? Just so we can have a little peek ahead.
Sure. So there's really the whole idea, and because exactly what I described before, where we recognize these are systems with a lot of noise and a lot of natural variation, and we're really hoping to use several different data sources to triangulate our results. So of course, one of them is survey results. So there is a survey part to this effort, but we're also hoping to use information around compensation schemes, for example, for attacks on livestock. Very often when livestock is killed by these big predators, owners are entitled to some compensation. And so looking at those records will allow us to have a better sense of what the trends in potential attacks on livestock are, and in the same way, when there's attacks on people, there's also very often compensation that people are entitled to. So looking at those records as well will help us have a sense of what of how things are changing. Another potential source of data for this would be enforcement information, and have a sense of how some of these behaviors are changing over time. And I think that's really one of the key things for us, is to first go beyond just survey data, and so just stated information, to have more indicators of actual behavior, of things that are actually of actions being performed in the real world, because we are also aware that regardless of how advanced our survey techniques might be, there is often the case that there is a gap between what is stated in surveys and then what then is the behavior actually performed out there in the world.
Thank you. Tilak, did you have anything to ask and add to that?
I think Diego explained most of the things that we are going to look at to assess the impact. I think other than that, I don't see any other things to look at.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask one, probably this will be our last question by the time both of you have answered it for us. One of the key challenges of any social marketing project is sustainability, is how to ensure that the benefits continue, the behaviors continue. So how are you preparing for the end of the project cycle?
Do you want to take this first?
Yeah, I can say something on that. So actually, what we are trying is as the community we are working are under the buffer zone user committees. There are a group of the forest user groups managed by buffer zone user committees. So what we are trying to incorporate is bring in those user committees into the social marketing campaigns, so that even though project phases out, they are still operating in the community, because they are legally found by the government of Nepal. So those are the groups which will stand on the field doing those activities, or behavior change activities, or putting on effort to social marketing campaigns. is they have been doing, but they have been doing in other ways, so that they can keep on putting on the activities to change the behavior. Such as, like, if we look at the predator-proof interventions, they have, like, buffer zone user community receives like 50% of the revenue generated from the national parks, so that they have their own constitution to mobilize those funds, and they still have the fund to carry on.
Okay, thank you very much. And actually, we do have a question coming in from, I hope I'm saying it correctly, Fel Caesar Cadiz, who is saying that this is an interesting approach. Do you feel that the use of the UTC approach compared to other impact evaluation tools is meeting your impact needs and that it's appropriate in the context of this project? So
yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's really crucial that I'll give you what I think is sort of the fundamental reason why we are using these types of approaches, and that is that very often I just don't think it's I think we need to move beyond simply asking people direct questions about behaviors that us ourselves would not reply. I have no incentive to reply honestly to. So very often we see projects around conservation and biodiversity management going out and directly asking resource users if they are breaking the law. If a stranger intercepted me on the street and asked me if I have committed a crime, there's really no incentive for me to admit that. And so fields like criminology, which the clues in the name deal with illegal behavior a lot, have realized that there is really a very, very strong bias in the way people talk about these types of activities, because they perceive that there might be consequences from telling the truth. And so I do feel that it is very important for us to start, if nothing else, also for ethical reasons as well, in the sense that these techniques allow for anonymization of the data. And so it's not a situation where, like in a traditional survey, where there are always potential ways in which respondents can be connected to their answers. And in this case, that's really not the case. And so at the respondent level, it is totally anonymous. It's not possible to track the answers back. And so I guess on those two accounts, one on providing more reliable information, and the second one on allowing people to remain anonymous while still contributing with information. I do think that it is a pretty important thing to UCT can really contribute quite a lot, and we're seeing we're seeing it being used more and more along with other similar techniques. So UCT, I also want to emphasize that UCT is not the only way of doing this. There are a few other ways of doing this. Randomized response techniques is a family of techniques that's also used for this, for example, and there are others. There are other types of ways of trying to achieve similar results, and I see them now being used more and more, and particularly in the context that I work the most in these days, which is wildlife trade, where a lot of the commodities being traded are illegal. I think we will see this type of approach become more and more popular.
Okay, thank you very much, Diogo. And that does conclude our presentation and our Q&A. Thank you both very much for a very interesting presentation on the topic, on the techniques, on your plans for going forward. I think this has been very valuable and very interesting, and I hope lots of people will listen to this in the archives as well who didn't get a chance to hear the complete webinar earlier. And we will move on to closing for today. please fill out an evaluation after the webinar. You will see a form come up when you close. These evaluations really help us make our decisions and choices going forward so we can make things work as well as possible for you. And again, just a little reminder about some of the upcoming events. And these events are available for you to view as well on the ISMA website. So you can always look them up there. And looking ahead, our next webinar is in January on the 23rd. And if you are in the Americas, it will be on the January 23rd for both Time 1 and Time 2. Rita Brophy is presenting a webinar titled From So What to Wow, How Co-Creation Energizes Audience Research. And you can read more about that on the ISMA website. So finally, thank you very much to Susie Copperthorne for handling all the technical aspects of today's webinar, and there were quite a few. So thank you, Susie, for being available for that, and thank you to Patrick Cook, who has stepped forward this year to be ISMA's second president. Patrick, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Tamara. And thank you, Susie, again, for all your hard work, and to everyone for pulling together today and last night's webinar. I also have to really say thank you to Diogo and Tilak for an amazing presentation. Really appreciate it, and we hope to have you back soon, perhaps when you have some more of the impact data. As Tamara mentioned, we do have another webinar coming up in January, so we'd love you to join us for that. Please do keep visiting the ISMA website. We've got lots of great stuff coming up, and we're changing that fairly regularly. There's also a calendar there, so if you want to check out some of the other events that are coming up. So once again, thanks to all of you who have joined us. This is the International Social Marketing Association, and we now conclude today's webinar.